welcome to Academics of PA. I'm Josie Schaefer here with Bruce McDonald. Say hi, Bruce.
Hey, how's it going?
You were supposed to say hi, Bruce.
Oh, hi. I'm supposed to say my name all. Okay, hi, Bruce.
Just kidding. We are about to introduce a great interview that Bruce did with the distinguished Professor James Perry that I unfortunately missed. But
yeah, you totally ditched out on that one.
I did. I'm so sorry. I had a work-life balance issue.
You know, your sister had a baby, so I guess we can't fault you at that one.
Can't. I had to get the house ready. Baby came home that day. But I think it was really interesting because in this interview, James Perry talks about giving up some house life or home life for work life. So I think I made the right decision.
Definitely don't blame me there at all. But I think it was kind of a fun interview. It was definitely learned some stuff about him and his past that I hadn't really expected.
He does a great job walking us through his history and lots of interesting tidbits from the beginning of his career.
True. All
right.
Should we give it a listen?
Let's go.
One of the things that we had asked you to come on, I will admit, is a little bit of a hidden secret that I didn't tell you ahead of time, is that you were one of the impetuses for creating the podcast in the first place. Will and I had the idea for creating a podcast, focusing on PA. We were trying to kind of figure out what niche you wanted to focus on. And you had posted a note on Twitter about Hong Kong being your second home. And Will and I got into this nice long conversation about how little we actually knew about you or the big names in the field.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in Hong Kong. I spent a semester there in 1986 as a Fulbright lecturer at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And that was my first exposure really to foreign soil. And it was my first trip to Asia. I loved it, made lots of friends there, people with whom I interacted for the next 40 years. And so, or 30 plus years, not quite 40 years. But both Hong Kong and China and also South Korea have been sort of second homes to me. And my wife would probably complain that I've spent more time there than I do with her in Bloomington. There's some truth to that from time to time, but for the most part, my wife and I have been together for 48 years. So she's not counting all that dead time we've had.
Well, I have to admit, thinking about Hong Kong and China in general, and comparing that to Bloomington are very starkly different environments.
They are. Actually, I went to Hong Kong within 5 months of having arrived in Bloomington. I arrived in Bloomington in 1985 in August, and then I went to Hong Kong at the end of 85, about the 26th of December, if I remember correctly. And so it was only really a few short months being in the small town. Of course, prior to that, I had spent 11 years in Southern California. So, I've lived in various places. Chicago as a student at the University of Chicago in the 60s, a very tumultuous time.
Mm-hmm.
Early 70s in Syracuse, which is most memorable for all the snow we got. Then I went to Southern California to escape the snow for 11 years. Then I've returned back to the Midwest, which were my roots from my early years as a native of Wisconsin.
Where in Wisconsin are you originally from?
I'm from a small town called Two Rivers. It's on Lake Michigan. My wife and I now spend summers in Door County, on the Door County Peninsula, which is about 60 miles north of our respective homes. We both grew up in Two Rivers in the 50s and 60s. And, it's just a marvelous part of the country that's a little bit slower than the coasts, opportunities for fishing, great food, lots of things we remember from our childhood. So it's marvelous to return there every summer for 4 months. We typically are in Wisconsin from mid-May to mid-September now. Of course, that's the beauty of retirement, that you're not necessarily tied down by fixed schedules associated with teaching classes and obligations to service and other things.
One thing that kind of find interesting is you went to the University of Chicago for your undergrad. Was part of that reason because you are from Wisconsin, so it's the close to home?
It really had nothing to do with being close to home. I have an identical twin brother, which is sort of an important part of my life history.
Huh.
He and I have taken different paths. I am the theoretician, so to speak, or the academic. He is the practitioner. He was 37 years as a city manager or assistant city manager. So we sort of took a fork in the road. We interestingly have degrees, undergraduate degrees from the same program at the University of Chicago, graduate degrees from the same MPA program, Syracuse University, the Maxwell School, and then he went off to practice, and I stayed on to get my PhD. So we have similar life histories, certainly during our first 23 or so years, but we also have some affinity for public service. But I took a different direction than he did, and he's to some extent my anchor for thinking about what we on the academic side of the field do with respect to our practitioner counterparts and peers.
That's really interesting. I don't think I've ever heard that you had a twin brother, but it's even more interesting that you kind of have that same path, and it's just the PhD versus the practitioner side that really creates that diversification for you.
One of the problems with being an identical twin is that sometimes you lose your own personal identity. And we grew up and we were raised in a period where there was a certain amount of preference for twins being more alike than different. And it really sort of took us to the point where we took that fork in the road. He went to practice and I went on continued on for the PhD after the MPA, that we were able to sort of establish our distinct identities. It was very interesting. Then I went to ASPA conference last year in Denver, and my brother had accompanied me, I think, for 2 of the last 3 years at the ASPA conferences, and people had become accustomed to seeing him at ASPA conferences. Many people approached me, they would say, "Where's your brother?" And what was interesting about that was the first time in about since our final days together as MPA students at Syracuse in the early 1970s, where I sort of had the reminder that I was a twin, and that for 40 years I had, gone on to establish my distinct identity from him. But we sort of appreciate one another's paths, but also recognize that we've had very satisfying careers, even though they've been quite different in the broad field of public service.
I think it's interesting, especially right now we have one of the problems of getting people to go into public service. As the MP director here, a lot of people come and we'll talk to them about what job working in government administration work looks like, benefits of it, how they can contribute back to society, things kind of along that kind of line. And I still have more people who are interested in the nonprofit side, even though it's harder to find nonprofit management jobs in North Carolina than it is on the public side. And part of that is there's this distrust amongst the students in terms of thinking about what government does and where they fit into it. And so it's interesting, not only did you go into it, but that you had a twin who did as well.
We grew up in a different era, and one of our first encounters as teenagers was with John Kennedy during the Wisconsin primaries. And that, I think, left a lasting impression with both of us. We also had parents who were of very modest means. My father was a foreman in local manufacturing plant, an aluminum factory. But they always gave us an appreciation for reaching out to others. Of course, we also have our religious foundations, which is in the Catholic Church. And although we're not sort of committed to the social consciousness of the Catholic Church deeply, I think that sort of logic, that the emotion and the identification with those who are in need, I think is something that also has been a sort of an important part of both my and my twin brothers' foundations.
Well, in terms of thinking about what you chose to major in undergrad, you did major in public affairs at Chicago. Did you consider any of the other fields that were kind of related back, which would be more along kind of what students would do now, or was public affairs really what you wanted to go into?
Well, public affairs was actually a new program. It was created when we were undergraduates, and I think because of the high level of activism in the late 1960s, rather than looking at, for instance, a field like political science, which at the University of Chicago at the time was highly distinguished because of well-known political theorists. We both were sort of attracted to a much more sort of engaged scholarship and an engaged major, and public affairs sort of fit that bill. It's sort of about 4 generations removed or 4 iterations removed from the Harris School, which subsequently I think sort of filled that gap or fill that role at the University of Chicago. But no, I didn't sort of think real seriously. I thought maybe at the time that the University of Chicago focus was very theoretical and abstract, and I guess I was attracted to that on the one hand, but I was also attracted to sort of making sense of the world, the world I encountered every day. And it sure seemed like engaging in research projects related to the Model Cities program, which was created in 1967 when I was an undergraduate, and some of the other things that were happening were much sort of closer to my heart, to my sort of to the core of my self-identity. Of course, another thing that I did in 1968, actually during a period of the Democratic Convention in Chicago that year, is I took an internship in a community called Beloit, Wisconsin, that was funded for the summer by the International City Management Association, or at least at the time was called ICMA without sort of the county identification in the title. And, I thoroughly enjoyed working directly with the city manager. I took on my role as an intern the same day as a new assistant joined who had been a graduate, I think, of Northern Illinois, who joined the city staff. And I had as close an association with the city manager and the other staff, the city attorney and the personnel director, the city planner, as the new assistant manager or administrator. So, I sort of got pretty good exposure during that internship to what local government was like. Although, for some reason, I never did, I think, seriously decide that local government was going to be my focus. I sort of thought more about state or probably the federal government. But I think one reason why I became an academic is I also didn't see myself as a bureaucrat in the bowels and in the inners of a major bureaucratic organization, sort of working within a fairly clear set of rules and restrictions and constraints that typically limits the activity of our bureaucrats, or at least that's sort of the way we historically thought about bureaucrats at the time in the early 1970s.
Right. Now, in terms of thinking of why you went to academia instead of practice, you had mentioned the bureaucratic aspect was part of your thought process, that as an academic you could work to potentially improve that bureaucratic process, or was it just that you were interested in the subject matter of public service rather than necessarily the doing of the public service?
I think it was more the latter than the former. That is, that I was sort of more, or thinking more broadly about public service and not anything highly specific. Although you mentioned earlier, going to the University of Chicago. University of Chicago and Maxwell made a difference for me in offering me essentially a full scholarship for my undergraduate years so that the tuition was covered. Being one of 2 college-age students who were simultaneously going to college in a family that made less than $20,000 a year was consequential, because the scholarship sort of covered the $4,000 a year it took to send the 2 of us to the University of Chicago. And then when I applied for graduate schools, I applied to Pitt and American and a number of others. Maxwell School stepped forward with a National Defense Education Act fellowship, which was essentially a 3-year ride that would permit me not only to get the master's degree, but also the PhD. And they said, well, you can vacate it if you vacate the fellowship if you decide to end your academic career with a master's and go into practice. But at least the fellowship to Maxwell sort of put me on the track of getting the PhD and thinking in terms of the PhD, even though I had sort of difficulty seeing my life, more than a couple of years or a year or two in advance. So the fellowship and the funding for both the undergraduate and the graduate were highly consequential to the choices of where I went to undergraduate school and graduate school, and also had a fairly significant influence ultimately on becoming an academic rather than a practitioner.
Now, kind of looking back, do you wish you might have gone the practitioner route, or are you happy that you stayed on the academic side?
No regrets. I'm sort of happy the direction I took. If I can live somewhat vicariously through my brother, and I helped him write a book after the end of his 37-year city management career, and I like to plug the book. It's called Blueprint for Building Community, which is available online and through your local bookseller. It's an interesting memoir and also sort of a set of reflections and depiction of his career in two cities in the Chicago area and the choices he confronted. So I really, though, have no regrets about becoming an academic or going into the university rather than practicing it. Yeah, it might have been interesting, but I really have not sort of spent more than 2 minutes, I think, of my career sort of thinking back to whether I might have preferred being a practitioner rather than an academic. And that's partly because, I've had a very good, satisfying career in the university, and to be honest, have done, seemingly an unlimited amount of interesting things. Spending 3 semesters at Yonsei University teaching in Korea, once as a Fulbright, once as a world-class university scholar, which was a Korea program to bring people in from overseas. Spending my Fulbright time in Hong Kong, more recently as a visiting distinguished professor at the University of Hong Kong for 3 years part-time. Spending several stints in Washington, working in the Health and Human Services and the Corporation for National and Community Service, spending time overseas at the Catholic University of Belgium. Those opportunities would not have been available to me had I become a practitioner. At least I don't think I can envision that having happened. But they certainly made life interesting. And at the same time, spent 6 years as the editor-in-chief of PAR. I was associate dean at the University of California, Irvine, the Graduate School of Management, for a couple of years. Before I left there, I was associate dean for SPIA on the IUPUI campus. So, even though I've had a relatively short or few number of stops at universities along the way, I've really had quite varied and stimulating experiences. And for me, as I also think being first a scholar rather than an administrator or activist or a public servant, I've also been able to sort of satisfy my intellectual curiosity, which is probably what took me to the University of Chicago to begin with, and sort of made that an interesting experience. But it's been something that I valued and have internalized and embraced, I think, my whole career. And so being able to stay engaged in intellectually interesting challenges and questions has been really sort of a very fulfilling experience. Maybe I would have done that as a practitioner, but I don't think about that much. I'm really sort of very happy with the course I took.
Is there anything that you would change if you could, looking back at what you have done career-wise?
I've had several instances where I've had to make big decisions in the course of my career. I came out at a period when public administration in the academy was growing rapidly. The year I think I left, graduated from Maxwell in 1974 and got my PhD, I had a wealth of job opportunities, including several in California that I had not even envisioned. When I went to my dissertation chair, Charlie Levine, Charlie sort of ripped up the list of places that I was going to apply to, and he said, "Here are 90 places. Apply to all of them." And many of them were in California, so I had job opportunities at UC Davis and UC Irvine, and talked seriously with the people at USC. The job market was somewhat different in those days because it tended to be more spring oriented than fall as it is now. I had some tough decisions to make on the sort of the direction I took because I did have a number of good opportunities available to me. And Charlie had a great deal of respect for the people at UC Irvine. And he basically said, go to Irvine, work there for 6 years. If you don't get tenure, or you may well not get tenure, it's a demanding place. You'll still wind up on your feet somewhere else. And so I took his advice and never regretted it. But it turned out to be a good choice because I did very well at Irvine, learned a lot, was stimulated by my colleagues, had a lot of responsibility from day one as a beginning assistant professor. I think that challenge sort of fulfilled perhaps my sort of own internal inclinations to be engaged and to be active, and maybe it was also just a reflection that I had learned how to be obsessive compulsive in my youth and in my undergraduate life and graduate study. No regrets there, although there were some important choices. But I think that sort of turned out marvelously well. Of course, the other juncture in my career was after 11 years at Irvine was to think about leaving, partly because the program was moving more in a business direction. It had been what we call a generic school when I started. And I didn't see myself as mainly teaching business students and working within a business-oriented environment. And then the opportunity at Indiana University Bloomington came along at SPIA, the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. And again, I sort of relied to a large degree on the advice from my mentor, one of my mentors, Charlie Levine. And Charlie had been a student in political science in the late 60s, early 70s at Bloomington before he joined the faculty at Maryland and then at the Maxwell School. And, Charlie said, or Charlie sort of, I think, brokered sort of the discussions with IU, but he had told me many years earlier when I had gotten an offer from another campus in the IU system, he said, you don't want to go to Indiana University unless you go to Bloomington. Of course, that was probably colored by his experiences there. We have lots of good campuses at Indiana University, but I sort of took him to heart in 1974 when I had my first opportunity with Indiana University, and I also took his advice to heart when I had the subsequent opportunity and the conversations with Chuck Bonser and colleagues then at Indiana University in late 84, early 85, and I decided to sort of shift universities. But interestingly, I just really spent most of my career at two universities, UC Irvine and Indiana University, although I did get exposure to the Indianapolis campus for 6 years as an administrator and in effect working outside the Bloomington environment. I also spent time at University of Wisconsin, at the La Follette School for sabbatical, and at Yonsei, and at Chinese U and Catholic University of Leuven. So I've been exposed to lots of universities. I've been fortunate to be affiliated with two excellent places, and places that were as much made by the colleagues I had as by the sort of the internal rules and culture of the universities themselves.
One thing I do want to kind of ask about is, you have, this wide variety of experience, and you have a fairly lengthy, publication record. One of the things that a lot of PhD students now and more junior faculty are having is kind of trying to figure out that work-life balance between what you have to do professionally, but also how do you maintain the home life and your family and everything else. Kind of thinking back about your career, how have you kind of worked to maintain that balance, or what has worked for you?
Well, if there's one area where I would say that I maybe haven't done as well as I should, it's probably the work-family balance. My wife can testify that I've spent many days away from home, or many hours sort of in the office rather than being at home. I've been fortunate to have a spouse who's supported me. I also have two great daughters. I'm getting a little bit emotional. One has a Master of Social Work and runs the recovery center, is the executive director of the recovery center in Bloomington. The other is a manager for a nonprofit that runs the Medicaid program in the state of Massachusetts. So although they didn't necessarily want to pursue the same course as their father, they are in what I would call public service and sort of committed to making their communities and the people with whom they interact in their programs better off because of their service. Of course, my wife was also engaged in public service for many years in the child care end of things, and she ran the Bloomington or the Monroe County school systems school-age care programs before and after school, and a variety of other related programs for over 20 years. So, we have a family that appreciates public service. My oldest daughter knows that I spent many of her birthdays at Academy of Management meetings, which was one of the sacrifices both she and I had to make in terms of the career I had. The Academy of Management always met, or usually met, during her birthday. So if we were celebrating her birthday, it had to be either after the Academy of Management meetings or after, but not during the meetings. But, I would certainly counsel people to find as many ways of intersecting with their families and sort of giving up work time for family time. Part of that is probably sort of getting away for trips, other engagements during the summers and the like. But you have to find ways, I think, of maintaining that balance. I probably erred sometimes in too much effort toward work, and we write these days about the dark side of public service motivation. I think there is a sort of propensity to become so committed to service that it can sort of harm or diminish our ability to sort of interact in other parts of our lives. As I indicate, I think my wife and kids understood that, or at least in retrospect understood the trade-offs that I was making, and have sort of forgiven me for time away. And now as a grandfather, I try to spend a little bit more time, and a retiree, try to spend a little bit more time with the grandkids and the family and the like. So maybe I'm finding some ways to sort of make up for that now, but we're still sort of closely connected, which is the ultimate result, I think, that we're looking for.
Right. So I have to ask really quick, how many grandkids do you have?
I have three, and they're all boys. Of course, I had two daughters, so it gives me a chance to experience boys and have a relationship with boys. Although as a grandfather, I have a lot more latitude to spoil them and not to worry about sort of setting limits or rules for them. So we have lots of fun. And my next trip is with the 8-year-old grandson who my oldest daughter, and he and I are all going to meet in Washington for spring break for a week. And so he wants to go with his grandfather on an experience. I took his brother to the Winter Olympics in Gagnon actually a year ago tomorrow. We left. Both the 8-year-old and the now 14-year-old are hockey players, and so we've spent 4 days on the greatest Olympic hockey that we could find. The gold medal games, the bronze medal. We did see the American women, beat the Canadian women in the gold medal game. That was quite an experience.
Oh, that's really cool. Who do you root for then?
I go along with the hockey because my grandsons and my son-in-law is a hockey coach in Connecticut. He's been over 20 years been the high school hockey coach in Enfield, Connecticut. They love the Islanders because the Islanders were sort of the home team. My son-in-law is from Long Island, and so the Islanders are his team, and so I root for the Islanders. I used to like the Blackhawks when I was in Chicago because Bobby Hull and Stan Mikita and folks were all playing at the time. But hockey is not my first sport, and I'm also a shareholder, and I don't want to say part owner, but a shareholder in the greatest pro football team in the history of the universe.
So you're a Packers fan then?
I am. So I met Vince Lombardi as I was waiting for tickets once. I didn't meet him, but he greeted the fans one morning. Actually, it was for the Baltimore game when the Packers were playing Baltimore in a playoff game, and they had tied, I think, in the regular season. That was the one that went into 5 periods with the disputed Don Chandler field goal. But I was at that game also, so I've been at many historic Packer games.
I'll talk about the Packers all day long, but kind of getting back to the issue at hand, one of the things I'm kind of curious about is you do have this large collection of research. How do you go about choosing the topics that your individual paper is actually going to focus on?
That's a good question. I think there's a process. If you go back, for instance, to one of my more influential and distinctive papers, and that's the 1990 paper by Lois Wise and I on public service motivation. That sort of, I think we've sort of expressed, at least indirectly or implicitly in the introduction, that both I and I think Lois had studied civil service reform and had been engaged in conversations about sort of the nature of the civil service from the late 1970s to the late 1980s. So it was over a period of 10 years where we did research that was related to the reforms and basically the agenda that was established by Scotty Campbell and others who modified the federal civil service and introduced labor relations for reforms, civil service, or merit pay reforms and other things. And then after that, you get to a point where you say, well, we've tried this, we've looked at this for a long time, it hasn't given us what we wanted it to do. Where do we go to now? And of course, I had been exposed by my professors at Syracuse to this idea that the public service ethos is important. Public service is different. People in the public service maybe march to a different drummer. And I got to the point of saying, well, we've studied the reforms introduced that have as much a foundation in post-World War II general management as foundation in anything else. And so I said, well, let's sort of begin to look at sort of a different philosophy, a different process, a different set of cognitions about how individuals are motivated. And that started the research on public service motivation. Typically, I think my sort of decisions about research really relate to, one is, I guess, opportunities. That, for instance, the 2009 paper I did with a couple of doctoral students, Trent Engbers and So-Yun Jun, that was a research synthesis of research on pay for performance, really sort of became salient because of two things. One, there had been a lot of studies that were conducted over the 20 plus years in which we were pursuing performance pay in the public sector. And we had gotten to this juncture where people were proposing yet again, or people had engaged in yet again, another set of reforms in the federal government. I think the third since the original reforms from Jimmy Carter in 1978. So you sort of throw your hands up in the air and say, well, this is about the time to sort of undertake some further look at performance pay, which is what we did, and we call that paper Back to the Future, which was basically trying to say, we keep moving forward by looking back, but in looking back, what do we learn about our past experiences? And I think collectively those past experiences, I think again, suggest that the motivational process is different in public institutions than it is in private, that money matters less. What you do and the difference you make matters more. Pursuing what I would call higher level intrinsic motivations, or motivations that are associated with public values, are more consequential and more motivating than the extrinsic rewards that seek to sort of recognize people externally rather than let them pursue what makes a difference to them internally. A difference sometimes that's grounded, in the sort of the broader sense of who we are as a community. And so, opportunity, and then sort of, something, an immediate trigger. Those are two factors. Is a particular research question ripe for study at a given time, and is it salient to not only me but to a lot of other people, or to the policy process or to the administrative process? So sort of an immediate trigger that conveys sort of the importance of the research topic, together with the viability of pursuing a particular research question at a given time. I think they have to come together, and those have been two factors that have been important to me in the whole range of things that I've studied over my career.
Certainly.
I mean, I started with doing research on public sector labor relations, and did my dissertation on that. But in the first half of the 1970s, probably the most consequential issue we faced was collective bargaining in the public sector, and people were scared about who was making the decisions, who held the power. Was it the labor organizations or the elected and appointed leaders, whether they be at the state level or local level, or to some extent the federal level? All that was the rules were different there. But so I've sort of tried to take up salient and timely questions during the whole my whole career. One reason why I sort of left the labor relations study, though, is it became a lot less consequential once we realized that the unions were not as powerful as we thought they were, and Ronald Reagan fired the air traffic controllers, and we went on to another set of issues.
In terms of thinking about PhD students or junior faculty, what kind of advice would you give them as they are starting to look to create their own research agendas?
One of the things that's been enormously important to me is what I would call mentors. You need to, get people who are reliable sources of advice, support, knowledge. During my career, I can point to at least 4 people. Of course, I mentioned already Charlie Levine, who was a godsend. Charlie came to Maxwell. We had lots of instability in the faculty ranks in public administration when I was there, and I think that was sort of characteristic of Maxwell in the 60s and 70s, with the exception of Dwight Waldo's presence. But, Charlie sort of helped rescue me when I was in need of a dissertation director, and we were good friends and worked together very well for 15 years. He opened a lot of doors for me. I always learned from him. And so that was a marvelous mentoring relationship. When I got to UC Irvine, Ken Kramer was my senior colleague in public administration. Ken was a great grant getter, again, opened doors for me, supported me, was a sort of a great collaborator. We wrote lots of things together, partly simply because we were interested in similar topics and, shared our, love of the field of public administration. Lyman Porter was my first dean. Lyman was sort of an outsider in terms of field. He was in organizational behavior, but was a path breaker with respect to constructs like job satisfaction and organizational commitment, which we sort of take as givens today. But I learned a lot from what he was doing in those areas. That's subsequently helped me not only in my research that I published on the topic of organizational commitment, which has gotten a fair bit of attention, but largely because of the work some work he had done, and my sort of embracing that, but also later learning that creating a scale like he had done on organizational commitment made great sense if you wanted to sort of advance research on public service motivation. If you measure it, it's real. And so I built it and they came. That was sort of a marvelous learning, and Lyman was largely responsible for that. And then, most recently, but actually somebody who sort of covered my whole career, was George Frederickson, who was one of my professors at Maxwell School, and somebody with whom I've interacted since 1971 as a student, and then subsequently as somebody who took his advice, and someone who learned from George and had some doors opened by George. So, getting a mentor and sort of finding reliable people with whom you can interact and whose judgment you trust and can provide you support. It's not necessarily following their lead as much as it is learning from them and getting support from them and trusting their advice. And, that's important for junior faculty and PhD students. And if you don't have that, you're at a loss from the first stages of your career. I think the other thing and part of this is reconstructed logic. Remember, we're talking about a career that's now spanned 45 years. So I'm sort of going back and trying to draw upon, emotions and ideas and thinking that goes back to the early 1970s. And some of that is sort of hidden maybe deeply in my memory, and maybe not also in that sort of part of my psyche that I can access. But I think I probably took some chances. Even that example I used of going to UC Irvine and going to a place where there were relatively few public administration people, but everybody around me was, a mathematician or a statistician or an operations researcher or an organizational behavioralist, was really sort of a step into unknown territory, one that I took partly because I trusted the advice of my mentor and also respected the people that I encountered there. But you got to take some chances. I've sort of encountered as the PAR editor most recently, situations where I would think that, boy, here's a really good opportunity to make a mark on the field. and I would approach people to sort of undertake a particular project. Some would take me up on it. Others would say, well, it's too much work, and I'm not sure that there's a payoff there. Of course, some of my biggest payoffs have been from research syntheses and sort of writing that article that was maybe sort of critical of the field, or sort of trying to take a different, or trying to step out from the ordinary and from the accepted. And so taking some chances or taking some risks, I think, is important. The other piece of advice is that I think, again, I'm sort of trying to translate the value I got from going to UC Irvine, where I was exposed to all sorts of things that were new to me, even though I had just finished a PhD. You think you come out of the PhD and you sort of know everything in the world. And I did know a lot about public administration. But going to a place like Irvine and a school of administration where most of the fields were outside of mine or different than mine, sort of taught me that there's a great value from sort of stretching yourself and being exposed to challenges, and also sort of working with people who are themselves, extraordinary, gifted scholars. And so, I learned from Lyman Porter and Ken Kramer and others, but I also sort of was able to work with them and sort of build my own repertoire of skills and enhance my repertoire of skills. So the piece of advice there I would be to sort of interject yourself in the research projects that are going to connect you to other talented people and to help you learn and develop. In terms of things I would recommend to junior faculty and PhD students, find a great mentor or mentors, and you probably won't have just one during your career. Take some risks. There are formulas for getting articles accepted. They're not necessarily formulas for making a difference and for being influential. So sometimes you got to break out of the formula and take a risk. And then third is to sort of put yourself in situations that are unique and different, that help build your sort of repertoire of skills and continue your learning process. And you've read this piece I've contributed to JPay, Journal of Public Affairs Education, where I found that my sabbaticals were marvelous learning experiences. Of course, my sabbaticals were also, my sabbatical in 1992-93 gave me an opportunity to connect with people in Washington at the National Academy of Public Administration, in the Health and Human Services. But I subsequently went to the La Follette School, where I was also able to develop the public service motivation scale that I published in 1996. Those were learning experiences and opportunities through the sabbaticals that sort of have spiced up and sort of kept engaged a career that's lasted more than 4 decades. And now I do about as much as I want to do, and probably not as much as I could do, but I'm sort of enjoying the opportunity to sort of take on a few small things or smaller things and do those to sort of round out what I've learned and done over the last 45 years.
Yeah. Since we are kind of coming up towards the end, there is one thing I want to ask, and that is, thinking about where we are as a field. We've certainly have changed since the beginning of your career. And thinking forward, where do you think that we as scholars, we as a field, should be putting our attention towards, or what do you think? What should we do from here on out?
Well, if you made me God, or I'm interpreting the question to some extent in those terms. One of the things I've written recently and done or given was the Gauss lecture in 2017 at the American Political Science Association meetings. Of course, John Gauss was a giant in our field from the era of the 20s, 30s, 40s. He was also subsequently, I think, a president of the American Political Science Association. And my Gauss lecture focused on taking professionalism seriously. And that, to me, is one of the areas where the field of public administration, I think, has a lot to gain. and could benefit if it sort of integrated the more formal study and serious study of professionalism into the field. I mean, we started much of what we're about sort of can be traced back to the founding of ICMA in 1913, and that was ICMA as a sort of initiated a respected professional group within public administration, the city management profession. But I don't see that we've embraced the study of professionalism. And the other thing I associate with professionalism, I associate two things that are very topical or tend to be topical in public administration over the years. One is values, particularly public values, and the other is ethics. And I think we sort of need to find ways of integrating values and ethics into the study of public administration. I think one way of doing that is to study the professions and to study public professions and to look at them in context. And to some extent, I see this as an extension of my research on public service motivation. But I would like to see the embrace of professions and professionalism. And one of the points I made in the Gauss lecture was this is a track that Dwight Waldo put us on 50 years ago. And we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Minnowbrook Conference. But Dwight said, well, we ought to maybe think about ourselves as professions, or think about ourselves as a profession, and think about ourselves as professionals. That has lots of implications, but I don't think we've done a particularly good job, although we've, as I indicate in the lecture, we made some efforts to do that, but I think we took the wrong directions, and I think we need to sort of reconsider what directions would help integrate professions and professionalism into our research and into thinking about public administration as a field. The other area I think that I think we need to continue thinking about, and I've certainly had enormous concerns about this as the editor of PAR, was what we've talked about since I entered the field, and that was the relationship between theory and practice. We are, I think, now at our strongest that I've ever known the field with respect to our thinking theoretically and embedding what we see in the world of practice in theoretical terms and in theoretical frameworks and in the theory. And we've also, I think, made great strides in terms of the quality of our research methods and our empirical study of public administration. But I think we need to continue to think about the connection between theory and practice, which I think is, from the perspective of people in the academy, I think has diminished. And of course, we see lots of criticisms of the theory-practice connection, or the ability of the academic to cross the boundaries with practitioners. But I see that as sort of a continuing area of tension and the need for redoubling our efforts to connect theory and practice if we want to be meaningful as an applied field of study.
Prior to my academic career, I worked on the Hill for a number of years, and we paid a lot of attention to what came out of economics because they had the capacity to kind of make their work applied to a certain extent. We could understand what it actually meant for what we were doing, whereas a lot of the more PA work, we had a harder time kind of understanding where that connection was.
I think we still have that difficulty of sort of making that connection, but I personally would like to see more of our, young scholars and senior scholars, for that matter, engaged in meaningful conversations with practitioners to try to sort of make sure that what we do is, not necessarily, we're not necessarily studying what's important to them for answering a question immediately before them tomorrow, but to answer those long-term questions that are will help sort of shape not only how we think about the field academically, but what we do practically.
I'd like to thank you for coming on today and joining me for the conversation, for being willing to come on and join us for Academics at PA.
Been my pleasure, Bruce.
So what'd you think?
There's a couple points that are really interesting, but I mean, the twin who's a practitioner, how cool is that?
Maybe people knew it was a thing, but it was definitely something that was outside of what I was really expecting.
Yeah, I mean, I would have gone to more ASPAs just to meet the twin.
I know. I want to know if he's actually going to be there next week. Since this comes out like the day before ASPA, are we going to have people like running around being like, "Are you Jim Perry's twin? Are you the twin?"
Well, they would know. He would look like a twin.
I guess we could always just run up to Jim Perry and be like, "Hey,
are you the twin?" Yeah. So, but I mean, having a touchstone in the practitioner life, what a great way for an academic to be able to reflect and talk about their work. And in this podcast, I think we are really touching on this sort of two sides of public administration. And so it's not surprising to me that his work is so relevant if he was able to have those ongoing conversations about what academic life means to practitioners with someone as close as a brother.
I think one of the problems we have is that we talk about this idea that the public administration research we do is going to have these big influences, but a lot of it comes back to, are we meeting the demands and the needs of what practitioners are experiencing?
Absolutely.
But in this case, he doesn't have necessarily that much of that practitioner experience outside of the internship that he did with ICMA. But he does have that constant connection, which I think gives kind of context for the career and the research interest over time, because there's always going to be something that ties it back to what they actually need at that given moment in time.
So now this question breaks a little bit. I think there are journalistic ethics issues here, but you mentioned that you had a really great conversation offline too. Was there anything from that you think our listeners should hear?
Well, I don't know if it really breaks journalistic ethics. Are we
Just in case.
The act of doing interviews is definitely something that is new to me. I was a journalism major in undergrad, which you would think between that and learning to research, there'd be some kind of experience with interviews, but that's not really what you, at least in my experience, not what you learn along the way. And so, doing the interview, I was very focused on, here's this kind of list of questions and let's have the conversation around them. And then our system, as soon as you stop recording, it takes a minute for the audio to upload. And while it's uploading, we were talking about a project that he's currently working on around professionalism and the practitioner side of things. And then we kind of get into this nice conversation of, where the field has basically kind of stopped thinking about professionalism and saying, maybe there's something to this idea of a profession. I mean, we were on for probably another 30, 45 minutes or so after we stopped recording talking about that, which I think was a lot more fun, at least for me, than the main base of the interview. I mean, the interview itself was interesting, but I was excited and kind of really got into the other part of it.
Well, and I mean, isn't it interesting that here he is in retirement, a distinguished professor, someone everyone in PA has read work from, and he's on to another great, exciting new project that will have real impact for our community.
Oh, absolutely. We were also talking, he's been working on a book that he's trying to finish that's kind of a swan song, as he put it, to public service motivation.
Okay, well, thanks, Bruce, for doing that interview with James Perry, and thank you, James Perry, for being on the podcast and sharing your experience with us all.
Yeah, thanks. It was a lot of fun. And I guess we say thanks to everybody for listening in.
And bye.